Good evening. It's great to have you here for this event, and we're pleased to invite to Collegeville Father Richard D'Souza, who he's such a youngster. When I look at he was born in 1978, and I think, well, God, that's just a couple of years ago. But so he's clearly made his mark in terms of in India. He began with his bachelor's degree at St. Xavier's College, and he earned that in 2002, but then went on to Heidelberg in Germany for a master's in 2005, and then went back to India to earn a theology degree, in which he did what I find a very interesting project from a theological perspective is that he had an adult sort of education, try and get people to think theologically, which was sort of a missing piece within their community. He comes from Goa, which is on the, my geography would say, southwest edge of India. And as you recognize by the name, it has sort of a European spin to it, but that was a Portuguese colony until 1961, I believe, right? Okay, so it's then he joined the Vatican Observatory in 2016, and since that time, he's been the last 2.5 years. He's been doing research and working at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So we're delighted to have you here with us and to help us to explore this question of two very important sources of authority within most of our lives. That how does the sort of magisterium of the church fit together with the magisterium of the scientific world? And I will let him go wherever he wants to go with this. His topic is toward a Christian approach to the natural sciences, integrating our faith and the sciences. Father Richard.
Thank you so much for the invitation to Collegeville. It's a great opportunity to come to this great place. I've heard so much of it from liturgy, from liturgy classes, so it's great to be here. I want to share with you something of my journey today in terms of the sciences, but also my faith journey. But I'm going to pose it in terms of a question, which I think would appeal to all of you, especially if you struggle in our modern world today in trying to reconciling the inner world of faith and our inner world of trying to find meaning with this outer secular world which we have, which is filled with the sciences. And this is a problem many people have, including sometimes religious, for us who are actually involved in the sciences. The question comes is, how, all of us have moments of faith and inner meaning. So this is an existential situation for all human beings. Some of us belong to a religious tradition, actively practice the faith, but all of us cannot deny that we have had moments of deep inner search, inner meaning, existential moments when we perhaps listened to a piece of music and wondered, or looked at a scenery and wondered, or perhaps confronted with a life tragedy or a life wonder. And there are moments when we are shaken out of our existence and start thinking about bigger questions. But in the world which we live today, it becomes very difficult for us to move seamlessly between the world of faith and the world of the sciences. And it becomes very difficult for us to talk in our professional lives about our inner lives of faith and inner lives of sciences. All of us have this problem. As a Jesuit priest, I often visit universities. I don't go in a Roman collar. I go as a normal mufti, and I'm there teaching in my jeans and t-shirt, telling them about my scientific research, and oftentimes they don't really know that I have this other life as a priest. It becomes very difficult to integrate faith and science seamlessly. And I think the difficulty which I face is faced by all of us is that we believe in both. They are both essential for our being. We know them. But it becomes very difficult to move seamlessly from an inner life of faith to an outer secular life. I think all of us end up with a very compartmentalized view of reality. Our professional lives and then our inner faith lives. It may not just be the sciences, but it also can be whatever profession we may be doing. Now, as an astronomer, I am often asked the question whether I have any deeper insight about God by looking through a telescope. And quite often people would ask me, have you ever seen God by looking through a telescope? I have to admit that I have not seen God through the telescope. Neither by much of my active scientific research, which I'm engaged in pretty much the whole of the week, I do not have any particular new insight into the nature of God or of theology. That's just very not my field. But what I do have is a lot of experience in research and in the sciences. And I live out my life of faith. And based on this experience that I find there is no conflict in me internally between my life of faith and my life of science. In fact, many times I would often say that my faith helps me to do good science, and my science often helps me to go deeper into my faith. One can move seamlessly at times. One has to be in the flow, as it were, in those moments. But I would like to then share from this experience and try to answer this question: how can we seamlessly connect these two worlds? And I don't want to take a very theological or philosophical approach. I want to take an approach which can start from the trenches, as it were, which common people can understand. And I think, first of all, we can start by examining why we have this apparent rift. I think the primary reason we have this apparent rift between the sciences and our religion is because we are operating under a paradigm, a dominant paradigm, which suggests to us, consciously and unconsciously, that science and faith cannot go hand in hand. This is what the world tells us. And this paradigm gets reinforced by the stories we and society tell each other in turn. Society tells us these stories and repeats these stories over again. Many of these stories revolve around familiar stories which we have heard from the past. And perhaps the most familiar story which gets repeated again and again is Galileo. Yes, the 16th century story of Galileo and the church. And by telling and retelling this story again and again, it actually gets solidified into a paradigm into our lives. And this story reinforces the idea that the church clashed with Galileo, and therefore they cannot go hand in hand. There can be no room for faith in an objective, scientific universe. Now, it's very difficult to change a dominant paradigm or a dominant narrative. If history has taught us anything, paradigms often are there to stay. They don't change very often. They can and do change at times in terms of revolution. And Thomas Kuhn would say, occasionally in every couple of few hundred years, there is a revolution and paradigms change, but it's very difficult to change a dominant paradigm. But I need to take a step back when the realization that to understand the power of paradigms and narratives in our lives. It all depends upon the stories we tell ourselves, and this in turn affects us how we interact with the world and how it influences our interactions, basically in our personal relations, but also in the way faith and science can interact in the world. Stories are powerful. In our own faith tradition, we often tell stories. We tell stories, we narrate them in order to create meaning as we interact with the world. Stories help us to navigate the world. Therefore, our lives are basically built upon narratives and stories. And the stories we tell tell each other influence the way we relate to each other, to ourselves, and perhaps even to God. So I think we can start by examining, first of all, the dominant story of Galileo, just for a start. Really can't go into the details, but there's many things which can be said about it. And it is really an active period of research, exactly why the church condemned Galileo. We can also say that many parts of that story really don't add up to a message which suggests that faith and science cannot go hand in hand. For instance, Galileo never intended at the end of his life to completely disrupt himself from the church. In fact, he never meant to show that science and religion couldn't go hand in hand. He remained a good Catholic till his very end, although under house arrest. His 2 daughters were nuns, and they took care of him quite well, even during his house arrest and to his death. And then there was this interesting question about the interpretation of Scripture at the time of the Reformation, when the church was being challenged from all corners, and the question of how does it mean to interpret Scripture. So it was really a very difficult time for the church. But perhaps the most interesting insight we can get is from the fact that the story of Galileo started getting retold only much later, around the 19th century. Nobody's talked about Galileo from the 16th to the 19th century. And it's only much later in the 19th and 20th century, with the rise of modernity, and there was much political ambition and anti-clericalism at that time, that society goes back to a story 2 centuries ago and starts telling the story again and retelling the story in order to reinforce a paradigm where science and religion cannot coexist together. I think we can get a lot of insight from the way the story has been told and how it influences our lives. And finally, there is ample of evidence that science and religion can go hand in hand. There are faith lives of many scientists as really inspiring. And an example which I would like to give to you today is not of a Jesuit, but of Father Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, who is in some ways the original discoverer of the Big Bang. Father Lemaitre lived around between 1910 and 1950, where he did most of his work. And he took Einstein's equations about general relativity and applied them to the universe. And he realized that in applying them to the universe, that the universe is expanding. And if the universe was continuously expanding, then it must have originated from a single point. And he did not call it the Big Bang, but in essence, that is the Big Bang. I like to say, if ever there was a very Catholic idea, it's the Big Bang. There are so many examples like this which I can relate to you. And the history of science is actually the history of many religious people and clerics doing really good and great science. We never tell these stories because that does not fit into the dominant paradigm, but their stories do exist. So as a Jesuit priest and astronomer, I do not experience experientially a conflict between my faith and my science. And I think I'm not alone in this. I have a number of fellow scientists who I work with who are full believers, full active faith believers, whether it be Christians, Muslims, Baha'i, or even Hindus. They really believe in their faith. And in a sense, yet these facts surprise most people, when you came to tell them that science and religion can go hand in hand, and a majority, not majority, but at least a good fraction of scientists can be actually active believers and actually practicing their faiths. Perhaps people are ignorant of the examples in history of religious people actually doing science. Or they operate under this dominant paradigm, this dominant narrative, which blinds them to any form of integration. Also, like to think that most of the general public is really not educated in the critical philosophical traditions, which probably you'll learn here at St. John's and other places, other seminaries and other liberal arts institutions, and they don't have this critical thinking to really examine their own paradigms, their own narratives under which they operate under. But even then, even if people really are educated in sort of an analytical philosophy, I often find that even for these people sometimes it's very difficult to uproot these deep-seated paradigms which are there in each of them, these narratives. They constantly operate under these narratives. They may intellectually know that science and religion can go hand in hand, but experientially deep down in their souls and the way they operate in life, they still operate under the old paradigms. I am convinced that the only way to change the dominant narrative is with another one, a more successful narrative of how science and religion can go hand in hand. I have long sought for such a narrative, for such a story, which could incorporate my sciences, but also my faith. But I really was looking for a story which could explain to people and incorporate kind of like the things I do every day in my research and in my sciences. My experience, not so much the knowledge I have gained, but the experience I have gained in doing research or in the sciences. And after much searching, I think I have finally found such a narrative. And it was always right under my nose, and it was always there. But I think I finally found it. I'd like to tell you then today, to introduce to you this story, this narrative, and try to retell the story in such a way that it could perhaps possibly be a dominant narrative for you. It's the story from the Gospel of Matthew, and it's the story of the three Magi. You all know this story of the three wise men in search of a newborn king and who followed a star. They were wise men, stargazers, perhaps the first Catholic or Christian astronomers in a sense, people of philosophy and science. They were seekers after a truth greater than themselves, and they went through great efforts to leave their native towns, perhaps in Persia, to find it. And in retelling this story, I want to construct a narrative really that will upset the dominant paradigm which we have today, but basically to communicate that science and religion can go hand in hand. So let me start by first asking the question, why were the Magi interested in a star? But let's take a step back even further from this question. Have you ever wondered why ingrained in each of us is a deep sense of amazement and wonder whenever we look up at the night sky? I've often done this experiment because in my outreach, you take a kid in the Sahara Desert or a teenager in India or even a professor at the University of Michigan, who consider themselves one of the top universities in this country, and you take them and make them watch through a telescope and look at some of the planets or the nebulae, some of these glorious pictures from the Hubble Space Telescope, and all of them will go, wow. Their faces will light up in amazement, and they will just go, wow. It'll kind of be very childish for a brief moment and go, wow. And I think if we would do the same today with wonderful weather outside, and I would point a telescope outside and make all of you look through it and some of these amazing features of the night sky, you too will go, wow. So then the question comes, why is it that there is something in each of us which goes, wow, when we look up at the night sky. And I think the answer for this lies really in a deeper understanding of the human person, of you and for me. I think the answer points out to the fact that we are all transcendental creatures. Deep within each one of us is a yearning to transcend our physical boundaries and to reach out for the infinite. We constantly yearn to know more and more about not only ourselves and our physical surroundings, but to go beyond. And in a way, this makes us, in our Christian anthropology, special and different among all the created creatures. The best way I like to visualize this is co-teaching from the book of Genesis. To visualize this is this famous painting of Michelangelo of God and Adam on the Sistine Chapel. All of us know this painting, God reaching out and creating Adam in that singular act. But I think there's another way to look at this painting. And the other way is to look at it as Adam reaching out beyond himself, reaching out to the infinite, to God, to divine. There is something deep within each of us which makes us go beyond ourselves and reach to the infinite, to the divine. This is this transcendental nature in each of us. Michelangelo understood that very well as an artist. And I think that's what he also tried to depict in that painting. We are by no means rational beings. We are transcendental beings. We are beings looking for meaning in life, yearning to reach the transcendent. This is what makes us active in life, to go forward in life, to reach out and reach the beyond. I like to say that all of our human activity is an expression of this search for the transcendent. Now, philosophers and theologians will perhaps think of the transcendent as the ultimate divine, but we can also think that all of human activities, including engineering, art, poetry, music, are all expressions of this transcendental search of the human person. In a sense, we are all reaching out to the divine, and these are kind of manifestations along the way of us reaching out to the infinite. And therefore, in such a framework, if that we are transcendental beings reaching out to the infinite, and in doing so, we go through all these physical steps of going about in our professional life, then there can be no separation between our professional lives and our inner faith lives. And our professional lives become an expression of this transcendental search in each of us. So in a certain sense, the three wise men, the Magi, looking for the star, looking for a truth greater than themselves, were answering a call to the transcendent. And therefore I like to say that the three Magi are the deepest reflections of our very self. They tell us how we are as human beings searching for the transcendent. In a sense, we are fellow wanderers and fellow searchers with the Magi. And the Magi are in many ways our predecessors. And they also show us how our professional lives, the things which we do out of passion, are deeply connected and an outreach of our inner faith lives. Now, each of us, there is this constant yearning and restlessness for the divine. There is nothing more transcendental and yet more physical than the cosmos and the heavens. That's why it's no wonder that the cosmos always fascinates us, because it's the most transcendental thing you can have, which is also physical. Among the sciences, the study of astronomy has always been called the queen of the sciences. It has always been the first scientific department which has kind of been established in the universities. In fact, in the University of Michigan, where I work, the first science department was the Department of Astronomy. And the first time, actually, the laws of physics were applied to the real world was to explain the motion of the planets. The Magi, who were therefore in search of that star, symbolized this fascination of humanity with astronomy down the ages. I should give you an example from our world history. We have so many examples of civilizations studying the heavens. In the Western world, you know that the church has long supported astronomy, right from the 16th century. They have active clerics doing research in astronomy, partly because of fixing the date of Easter, but also just because in our Christian perspective, which we have imported from the Greeks, the heavens was the most perfect world, and everything below was just merely a reflection of that heavenly perfection. And the Vatican continues to support research in astronomy in the form of the Vatican Observatory, of which I am a member, about 14 clerics, Jesuits, and diocesan priests who study astronomy and just do research in astronomy. But if you can think of all other civilizations, the Indians, the Chinese, the Mayans, the ancient Greeks, all made remarkable observations of the night sky, each in their own way. There was a constant fascination for the heavens down history. So we have been constantly fascinated with astronomy. And the only way to explain this, and also our initial wonder when we look at the night sky, is to realize how transcendental astronomy is in terms of being so much out there and an expression of our transcendental search, but also being the most physical thing you can utterly reach. I'd like to go back to the story of the Magi. That's the story I like to tell. The question I'd like to ask you is why did the Magi set out on a search? Why did they set out on a search? And what can this tell us about ourselves? So why did they set out from their search? And why did they leave the comfort of their homes? I think the answer for this is in the search for meaning. One of the most fundamental searches we have as human beings is the search for meaning. So we're not just only rational animals, and we are often far from rational, but we are really meaning-seeking animals. We constantly navigate the world through the meaning we give to it. And we constantly yearn for more and more meaning. Perhaps the ideas which go back to Viktor Frankl is that we are meaning-seeking animals. Without meaning, we don't move forward. And you can see the most extreme example of this when people actually lose meaning, they stop moving forward. And often it ends in extreme forms of losing hope and meaning in suicide. But let's take a step back and take a cue from philosophy. We find that meaning, when we look for meaning can never really be found within a system. Perhaps here I'm using a bit of Wittgenstein here. Meaning can only be found external to a system. And therefore it's often important to realize that we search for meaning, that we really cannot find meaning in physical objects. Meaning is often found beyond the physical. Wittgenstein best explained this by in nature of his games. Like you think of a board game you're playing, you can play the board game. The board game has a couple of rules and you keep on playing these games. But why are you playing the game? There is meaning in playing the game only if there is a prize. And the prize is only external to the system, in a sense. So I'd like to point out to the fact that only something which is truly transcendental can give us meaning in life. So only something which encompasses a transcendental element gives us meaning. So in a certain sense, if the sciences are interested in the physical world, then sciences alone cannot really give us meaning in life. Only something which is transcendental, maybe a search for the divine, or something which makes us move beyond ourselves, it is that which gives us meaning. And by corollary to this system, therefore, any system imports its values from outside the system. I like to say that science does not have an intrinsic set of values by itself. It needs to import its values from outside. So its core values are often imported from the dominant ideology of its time, be it modernity or anything else which it fancies at that particular moment. But we look for meaning, and that's what makes us go out in search. Why do we set out in search for meaning? And what do we hope to find? I like to think that it also reflects to us, we can reflect on this and understand that there is something deep within the human person which makes us restless. There's a certain restlessness which each one finds deep within each of us. And in some way we are very unconsciously aware that we are living in a sort of an exile. We live our lives in sort of a riddle, partially separated from God, from each other, and sometimes even from ourselves. We experience love, we experience community, peace, but never in this fullness. And we yearn for that fullness. Life is like a riddle for us, it's a mystery. And God, who is omnipresent, is often very distant. Now, when we look at the heavens and study the cosmos, in a certain sense, it fulfills us. It awakens something with us, maybe for at least a brief moment. I like to say that by looking at the heavens, it temporarily takes us out of exile, and we get a sense of completeness. The heavens, in the old philosophy, are perfection, right? It is the most perfect world. So in the sense that it takes us out of this exile, of this existential exile video. And as the director of the Vatican Observatory, Brother Guy Consolmagno, he puts this quite closely. He says, when he looks at the heavens and he studies astronomy, it reminds him that there is something more important than what is there for lunch today, in a sense, because it's something beyond the immediate. It fills him with something, a transcendental meaning to go on in life and to work. And not to think about immediate concerns which are close by to us. But even then, even astronomy, which is perhaps the most transcendental of all the physical sciences, can only temporarily put us out of exile. And it can only temporarily put us out of exile because it is not really fully the transcendental. Only the fully the transcendental, the divine, can put us out of that exile and give us full meaning. And this also perhaps explains to us why we go on in life, moving from project to project. Because each time we start a new project, it gives us meaning. It temporarily gives us something to do. We achieve that project, the meaning kind of goes away. Start off with a new project, that gives us new meaning. We move from project to project to project. And this kind of fits in our own experience that we really are meaning-seeking animals. And it's only the totally transcendental which can give us meaning. Why did the Magi set out on the journey? What did they take along with them? The story tells us that they took 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But I like to pose the question, what did the Magi actually hope to find at the end of their journey? If they knew what they were looking for, then they would know what to take along. So if they knew that they were going to find a child who was going to die, they would take gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But then we can reflect about the question: what elements did they need to be successful in their journey? And in a similar question, I like to ask the question: what do we need to be successful in our respective journeys? What does a scientist need to be successful in his or her search? I like to answer this question that perhaps what is needed to be successful is not gold, frankincense, and myrrh. We shouldn't be carrying that around. But something else. And I like to pose this as: we need faith, hope, and love. And I'm going to spend the next few moments working this out, why I think we need faith, hope, and love in our journeys, and why people with faith, hope, and love really make good scientists. Let me start off with faith, because that's perhaps the easiest to explain. So much of science is actually based on faith. At a fundamental level, I have faith that the world was created by a God who was... let me start with this way. First, in my scientific theories, I need to have faith. Faith, basically, that what I am researching depends upon some assumptions I need to make, and I cannot reasonably prove everything, so I have to make some reasonable assumptions. So I need to have faith in my assumptions. I need to have faith in the research my predecessors have done. I just cannot go and repeat everything they do and empirically test everything they did. I need to have faith that at some point what they did was right. Sometimes I may evaluate their research and question it, but only if I have a reasonable doubt. So there is some sort of a reasonable faith in sciences. But I'd like to take it to a more fundamental level of why we often need faith. I only study the universe and I only study the physical world if I know that it is governed by fixed physical laws. I can imagine if I lived in a world where I thought that the laws of physics constantly change. Constantly change, that if I would study it today and it's different tomorrow, what would be the purpose of studying the laws of physics if they were different today and tomorrow? And this comes back to an assumption we make in our theological approaches, where we think that the world was created good by God and that He was not capricious. And He made the world to follow certain laws. And you see this most clearly in the civilizations which produced the sciences. All great ancient civilizations observed nature. But very few of them came up with the sciences, the physical sciences. In the Western world, where we are influenced by the Hebrew God of how He created the world, and He created the world good and worthy to be studied, and Greek rational thought, science flourished. In other civilizations, where the God was capricious and changed His mind every day, like perhaps in the Greeks, sometimes the Greeks, sometimes the Chinese, the Indians, the Aryans, they never actually developed a full scientific approach. They observed the heavens, but they actually never developed a science. Why would you if the laws changed every day? For good science to occur and for civilization being able to understand the law, to study the laws of nature, they first have to assume that the laws of nature will not change. And that goes back to an assumption in the Hebrew-Greek world that God made the world good, worthy to be studied, and He doesn't change His mind every day. In some sense, we need faith to do the science we do. At first at the level of assumptions, at the level of sciences, but even at a much more basic level. Let me move on to hope. Much of science is driven by hope. Hope that we will be better able to understand what we do not understand today. Hope that that our study of the sciences will improve the quality of our life. If any of you are working actively in the sciences and have to write grants like I do, and apply to NSF or various funding agencies, I have very reasonable hope, and I'm confident that my scientific research will succeed. All scientists can relate with the idea of hope. That's the reason why I pursue a certain aspect of scientific research and not the other one, because I'm pursuing one idea, one hypothesis, with the hope that this will go through. It may each a dead end, but I have a reasonable hope that that works through. So faith and hope are kind of easy to understand. Now I'm trying the most ridiculous of them all. Why do we need love? How does love fit in all? I like to point it this way. The more I do science, the more I realize that science is really a conversation we have about the universe. Science is not really, when you study the sciences in undergraduate level, you basically are given a textbook filled with facts. You're given a facts. And these facts are taught to you, and this is the sciences. But this is not how the sciences developed. The science, often it is a conversation about these facts between a number of scientists. One would propose something about the nature of the moon and how it's going around the earth. The other would dispute it. There would be further questioning, and this conversation would go back and forth, with a rational thought, but slowly you're converging through the truths. Science is really about good conversation. Some of the best research topics you come up with is actually by conversing with fellow scientists and saying, hey, that's a problem. How do we solve it? It goes back and forth. You can never do good science by sitting in your room and in your cell, isolated from the world. You need to publish, you need to go to conferences, you need to converse, and that's how good science happens. Today, we are becoming increasingly aware that for good science to happen, you need to ensure that the conversation happens. And a conversation can only happen if you have a good community and you allow a diversity of voices. That you allow people who do not normally talk, come up with strange new ideas. That people who are normally not heard can also say their voice and also propose things. I work with a particular professor at the University of Michigan, and we have been rather successful together, but actually we are a really bad fit for each other because we think alike so much. So we are often like an echo chamber in the sense of I would propose one idea and he would propose, and we are patting each other on the back, and we write out this paper, and then we go for a conference, and then lo and behold, it's all wrong. But this is how science is. Bad science happens when people start thinking alike. Good science happens when there is a diversity of opinions. Now, you can only enable that diversity of opinions if you have a loving relationship where you can allow those voices to be heard. Some of the, what we call as principal investigators, PIs of big groups in medical research at the University of Michigan would often tell me that their main job is not only to direct the research, but to allow a very amicable atmosphere within the lab that people can cooperate with each other and talk to each other and work with each other. Good, loving atmospheres contributes to good sciences. I think the sciences need faith, hope, and love. They are analogical to what we consider faith, hope, and love in our religious spheres. But in many ways, faith, hope, and love ensure good science. Therefore, I like to think that the biggest gifts the three Magi were carrying were not their gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but their faith, hope, and love. But let me return back to the story of the Magi. I think there is a hidden gem at the end of the story which helps us in trying to understand how science is done. I think the real gem in the story is that after they looked for the star and they went to search for beyond it, they ultimately came to the child, Jesus. And not just any child, the divine child, the Son of God. And in a way, it is here that they had their epiphany. They were looking for something. They were really looking for something. But did they really expect to find the child Jesus in such a poor and such dilapidated structure out there, shivering in the cold, with these peasants as parents? After all, they came with gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They were rich people. And they knocked at the gates of Herod. I like to say, to reflect on this and this confrontation with what they were hoping to find and what they actually found. And I would have been really loved to be there and look at their faces at that moment and say, were they consoled? Were they astonished? Were they satisfied? God showed themselves to them in a completely different form from what I think they were expecting as men of philosophy and men who were searching for greater things. And reflecting on this, I often realize how often in my own research, I find that the reality I'm searching for at the end of my search is completely different from my expectations when I start off an experiment. I find that the universe is constantly surprising me. It's just not how I expect it to be, and not how my models suggest that it should be. In fact, in many ways, we try to force the universe to behave to our models, and it just doesn't fit and doesn't work. And then we are confronted with that, and then finally we write a nice paper about it, and that becomes a big discovery. I learned this hardest of lessons, actually, in my PhD that I was doing in Germany at that time. At the end of my PhD, when I came to the University of Michigan, I realized that 1/3 of my PhD was completely wrong. Completely 1/3 of it was wrong. And the reason why it was wrong was basically we have a shorter PhD in Germany, 3.5 years, and my PhD supervisor told me, we are very, success-driven. There was a success-driven. You need to get this result to graduate. And I was like, I need to get this result to graduate. So I was searching for that result and tried my best to get that result. And even though the universe was not fitting and the galaxy which I was researching did not fit the models, I made it fit. I really thought, I convinced the supervisor, I convinced the committee, we almost published the paper. And it's only when I came now to the University of Michigan, now hearing a diverse opinion, completely different opinion from now my other research guy, and he's like, really, does that work? And we realized, no, it did not. And the reason why I went wrong was because I forced my models onto reality. How much of good science actually goes about by saying, oh, that's strange. Let me look at it again. The universe doesn't fit our models. And this is how science progresses. When you confront what you expect to find with reality. God appeared to the Magi as the total other. And they said yes. And I think good scientists need to be open that reality never fits their models. And that's when they learn. I'd like to end by suggesting then that there are two spiritual values which one needs to be good in science. And I think this is broad not only in the sciences but broader in all our lives, and kind of shows us how I think the Magi encompass these two values. And I like to call them a poverty of heart and a chastity of heart. I'd like to explain this to you. What do I mean by this? By poverty of heart, I mean that the attitude which allows us to kind of detach ourselves from our own experience and listen to the universe, to what it's trying to tell us, the story it's trying to tell us. If our minds are filled with our own ideas and how things should fit and the laws of physics and it should work in this and this way, we are really not going to learn anything about, and science will not make any progress. And this is good research happens when you have a certain poverty of mind and heart. When you're allowed to empty yourself of your own ideas, listen to other people, and even listen to the data which you are researching. But I also believe we need a certain chastity of heart. Now, while we commonly refer to chastity as something specific to sex, it's actually much more general. And Christian charity centers on how we actually deal with nature, with others, and with God. To be chaste is to be, in the Christian perspective, to be fully respectful of the other person, to be fully respectful of nature, and to be fully respectful of God. To be chaste means to have patience and to have respect of the other person, not to hurry things. Now, forgive me for anthropomorphizing the world and the universe, but allow me to do this for a brief moment. Think of the universe as a physical person, and you are trying to understand this physical person. You're waiting for this person to reveal his or her gifts to you, his or her secrets. And all you can do is be patient, wait and listen. You cannot rush the process. So much of I find that I went wrong in my PhD was because I rushed the process. There was a certain lack of chastity there. And so much of contemporary scientists I find so much under pressure to publish or to perish. They race towards an exciting new discovery, not willing to wait and ask the question, hey, what is my data and what is the universe telling me about? I really feel that a person can be a good scientist if he or she has a certain poverty and chastity of heart. In a certain way, the Magi encompassed these two great values. In spite of all their learning, they wanted to learn about the star. They were willing to come down and listen to the child, even bow down and pay him homage. And they traveled that long journey, perhaps in silence and doubt, wondering whether their journey would be successful or not. And at times, I'm sure they were under doubt to give up and go home. Or maybe even find something which looked like what they wanted to find and take it home and say, hey, I found it. But they pursued in their journey. And ultimately, they found the child. It may appear startling to all of you how I have incorporated the journey of the Magi as a good representation of one's scientific journey. Or you may be appalled that I have reduced everything to spiritual values. But the more I talk to professional scientists and my colleagues about this, the more they resonate with this. When I talk to them about quantum mechanics and consciousness, they just don't know where to start. When I start talking to them about faith, hope, and charity, and about getting grants and rushing research, they resonate with this. And I do hope, therefore, that this framework, this retelling of the story of the Magi, can offer you a framework then to go and re-examine your own lives and to retell that story again and again so that it becomes a dominant narrative for each of you. I've often told this story to a bunch of groups of people. The best response I got was at the end of from two groups. One was from a group of medical students at the University of Michigan, and so one of them came up to me and says, "Yeah, but you can take this analogy a little bit further, and you can say, hey, the Magi actually went back home and told the world about it. That's kind of like publishing and outreach programs." And they were like, "Yeah." And the other group was the lawyers at the University of Michigan were telling me about research is that, sometimes in research you are desperate and you go knocking at every door possible, trying to incorporate all possible angles for your research. So you try and talk to the biologist, the chemist to get a confident idea. They actually knocked at Herod's door asking for an answer. So people use this as analogies. In whatever way one uses this analogy, right? By telling and retelling this story, I hope it can be a dominant narrative for a true integration of science and religion, that we can move seamlessly between the two. Thank you.
I think we have some time for questions, and Father Richard will field them.
Yeah, sure.
We talk about God as knowing all things, at any rate, does God learn? Or is that not a thing that you should try to ask?
Oh,
Could God have made, if there had not been human beings, could God have made a poem?
I think that question is beyond my expertise of whether God can evolve or not and whether he changes. That is really a theological question meant for the experts. I would not dare to answer. I think God changes, but that would be anthropomorphizing God in his own way.
Yes. I was just wondering if you think that there's an increasing amount of love necessary in astronomy, just because it seems like maybe hundreds of years ago, just one or two astronomers could look up, make observations of planets, positions and stuff, just with very simple equipment. But nowadays, it seems like the equipment necessary to make a lot of the observations require these, satellites that take huge teams of people to put up there, and then the data then gets shared by a lot of people.
Yeah. I do think that the sciences are evolving the way among all fields, whether it be biology, chemistry, physics, astronomy. The sciences are continuously evolving in terms of the diversity equation which each of them, especially, and they're all at different stages. Some fields have less representation of women and less representation of underrepresented minorities, and some fields are much more advanced. Each at its own pace. But I do agree with you that, especially in this era, when science is done not by just working in a laboratory by yourself, but working on a broader field where you have to work with each other and cooperate with each other, that this fosters more cooperation and more loving atmospheres. I do agree with you on this. In fact, a year ago, I was interviewing a bunch of big, principal investigators of big research teams. And they have been very successful in their field, and we were trying to understand what makes a successful principal investigator from one who has who really can't manage his or her team. And we realized, and we are talking to them, by interviewing them, we realized they often said, if we have a bunch of people working on a project, and if we have two persons who we need to choose for the team, and we find one is a clever person, really clever, brilliant in his or her field, but really cannot work with each other, and the other one is an average person, a physicist, I mean, clever, but not at the top of the field, but has these great social relations, guess who we will choose? The one with the better social relations. It's because teams work better that way. And because the nature of the science we do today involves so much of cooperation, that yes, there is this element of love in that way. Yes, sir.
Just wondering how the research agenda gets set at the Vatican Observatory. Do people bring their own projects there?
Yes, so in the Vatican Observatory, we have those of us who are working there have complete freedom in choosing our projects. What we do is that we have general areas of research which we have been assigned to each one of us, and in general, there is no overlap among people, and that the reason why there is no overlap is that to have multiple, so each of us has his own circle of influence in the diverse field. So I work in galaxies, the others works in stars, a third one will work on planets, the fourth one will work on meteorites, or we try and have different fields. And the thing is, I overlap with 1,000 people, they overlap with so our total outreach is much larger. But we do bring our projects. We have a choice of bringing the projects we want to work on. So we start with this. I heard this hand first, and then yeah.
I have two questions. One is related to the story of the Magi. It's not clear to me what you think is going on there, right? So there's claims about astronomical phenomena.
Yeah.
There were ancient astronomers. They knew a lot. They had calculations that were really remarkable. Do you allegorize that story away, or as an astronomer, do you think, hey, there was something that happened in the heaven, and here it was? I mean, the way it's presented can't literally be true, right? You don't follow stars. I mean, we're moving, they're not, right? So there's that. But is there something around that time in history that you think, here's the astronomical phenomenon, it's rather interesting, but it was incorporated into the gospel story? That's my first question. Mm-hmm. You want me to ask the second one? The second one's different.
Oh, okay. Let me ask you this question. I'll answer this question. So yes, I allegorize the story.
Yeah, what's going on there as an astronomer?
Yeah. So basically, there has been much research and much speculation about what could possibly have been an astronomical phenomenon at that time. There's much research on this. There are many postulates. It could be the best possible suggestion is a conjunction of planets, which means a couple of planets coming together around the same time and overlapping to have a very bright star. It explains part of the story. It doesn't explain everything. But as a person who understands how to read scripture, that is not the point of the story. I think concentrating on an astronomical event 2,000 years ago takes us away from the primary message of that story, which was that the three Magi found the child and how they lead us to the child. I personally do not find it fruitful to pursue the astronomical event. We get many questions in the Vatican email box, and all of them, and 50% of them was, what is the Star of Bethlehem? And we rarely answer that question, but let me put this straight out, and this is how I think about it. Yes, your second question.
Yeah, the second question relates to, you mentioned how there's this paradigm of antagonism between science and religion that we shouldn't really buy into, and maybe we should replace it with a different paradigm. And you give the example of Galileo historically, right, as something that gets told and retold. And I'm wondering, how does that fit into the new paradigm you want to propose? Because it seems to me there's something irreducibly embarrassing about what happened with Galileo in relation to the church. He proposes the heliocentric theory, and he's threatened with torture, right? The instruments of torture are laid out in front of him, and he's forced to recant, and so he does so, right? But not with any intellectual honesty, a kind of eye-rolling event. I don't know how that story could be told with a kind of, in a way that just sort of is completely unembarrassing to what happened with the church at that time. So what
it is a very embarrassing moment in the church. There's no doubt about it. Nobody's denying that. In fact, the Pope, a bit too many years later, apologized for it. John Paul II actually apologized for this. There are many other moments in the church which are equally embarrassing, which we can talk about, and including scientific ones. Like people where at least Galileo was not burned on the stake, some were even burnt on the stake. Just to give you a flavor of things that happen. What is interesting from all these perspectives is how these stories are retold and when they have been retold. Equally, in the sciences, there are equally more embarrassing stories. For instance, if we consider Newton, one of the greatest of the physicists in the world, who actually put a physical basis to Einstein's theory, but Newton wanted the planets to be in order, and he wanted them to be a stable system. He couldn't get it to be in his system, to be a stable system, and he then said, what keeps them together is God. This story is never told about Newton, because it's too embarrassing, because that you would embarrass the father of physics. I would like to point out, just from a reflection perspective, stories are told often with a certain agenda. And if we realize that, then we can hope to change the agenda. We can admit we made big faults, and nobody's hiding or denying this, but I think we can set the agenda.
First, I just want to thank you for offering a story that not only challenges the dominant paradigm, but also seems to me to be pretty immediately compelling and really founded on a sound theological anthropology. What happens when that theological anthropology itself starts to come into difficulties with the perspective that maybe, everything is just it's just an accident, that the atoms arranged in such a way that I desire the transcendent, or whenever doctrines like original sin or the immediate creation of the soul by God come in, are troubled with the theory of evolution.
Yeah. So you may have noticed that in the approach I'm taking is not an ontological approach with dealing with specific theories in religion or in the sciences. I'm not trying to fit evolution and some theological truths. I've taken a methodological approach because I think that brings most profit. Scientists can relate with that, and people on the common street can relate with that. It takes much more work to actually bring scientific theories to it. And I find that they are often non-fruitful. It's like often fitting a square into a circle in a peg. This is my basic skepticism about approaches which try and fit it. Oftentimes there are oppositions, and sometimes visible oppositions, which may come. The way I go about this is methodologically. I would like to make both parties aware of the assumptions and the biases involved in it. So in a sense, what is it we believe in? Because we can really see that those are our beliefs, and we sometimes don't have too much. We have like a logical reasoning for it, but it doesn't founded on facts. But also to say that the same side is often true in the sciences, that there is some ideology in the values they adopt, and that to be aware of that comes only with deeper reflection. So if you make people aware of their methodology and their assumptions, then you can have some form of dialogue. This is kind of the limited approach which works for me and for some few scientists.
Thank you.
Yes.
What do you make of the maybe more on the popular front these days, the last 10 or 15 years, a very adamant position among scientists, social scientists, which really seeks to put the church or the life of faith into some sort of an obsolete frame. Like the church has outlived its worth. A good example would be Christopher Hitchens, who was at the end of his life was arguing that the church had pretty much outlived its usefulness. And
Yeah.
numerous other very
Notable science. Yes. Including Richard Dawkins. Yeah.
thinking about spiritual
Yeah.
derogatory terms.
Yeah. I like to point out the best way to do this is to explain to them the what is the death of religion paradigm put by Emil Durkheim, a sociologist who often say, oh yeah, they predicted at the end of the 19th century that religion would no longer be there by this time, and it would be completely declined. And sociologists today look at the numbers and they find that religion is only increasing. And even not only is it increasing, it's so vehemently changing world opinions and often dividing people and etc. The number of secular people are a dying breed of minority. What this tells us is that, in a certain sense, people who take these extreme positions are not really listening to the data, which is telling them a completely different story. That people often need meaning in life, that meaning seeking or seeking for the transcendent is an integral part of the human person, and then by making everything physical and and everything so imminent, that you are neglecting a very vital dimension of this human person. I think the best scholar for this would be maybe Charles Taylor, who has really thought these issues out, but often Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins won't even read Charles Taylor or what even modern sociologists would talk about, because they are quite limited in their approaches.
But it seems to me like I go out and I speak to people in my family, and they've sort of assumed that kind of the academic institutional mindset these days is one of acceptable atheism.
But that's a paradigm, right? That's a narrative. You can change that narrative if you retell a story sufficiently loud enough and often enough to make that a paradigm. And a successful story in order with paradigm. What you're telling me is just about paradigms and narratives. Yeah. Yes.
So, in that case, when people ask you, do you see God through a telescope, instead of saying no, why don't you launch into the paradigm?
If I can keep them a captive audience for 1 hour, yes. But often people don't have that patience to listen to me for an hour. I mean, yeah. I think we can end here. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Father Richard, for really giving us a very practical and significant way of moving forward on this dialogue between science and theology, or science and religion. And thanks for making it to the far reaches of Minnesota here in this kind of weather. So thank you all for coming. So hope we can do something like this again.